Hi everyone, thanks for being here. Yvonne and I are going to talk about Project Inception. We've titled this Behind the Closed Door because... all right. We've titled this Behind the Closed Door because we're talking about things that traditionally happen at the beginning of a project during the inception, and we want to kind of open that door and bring it to the later end of a project to you senior engineers. So we'd like to introduce ourselves first. Yvonne will start.
I'm Yvonne. I'm a business analyst here at PromptWorks. That's the face that I make when Hangouts is not working and clients waiting for you. I've been working with Agile teams in some capacity as like a PA or a PM or an Agile coach for many moons. A lot of my experience, particularly when it comes to inception, Agile enablement, and building really healthy, happy teams was from part of my experience at ThoughtWorks. And so specifically with the Inceptions today, I'll be talking a little bit through that.
And you know me from the last panel. My name is Olivia. I'm a software engineer at DuckDuckGo. Prior to that, I was doing user experience and software development at Punk Avenue. So I'm going to be taking a user experience and software perspective on these talks, sharing how you can apply that, or on these exercises, sharing how you can apply them to your work as an engineer. And this is a picture of me in San Francisco trying to smile, but it's not as nice as Philadelphia. So.
Yeah. Cool. All right, so let me see a quick show of hands. How many of you guys have heard of an Inception? Sweet. Prompt workers don't count. How many of you have been in an Inception, participated in one? That's what I thought. So we're here today to talk about Inceptions. And an Inception is basically a discovery workshop. A lot of us, I think, have been in the situation where projects come to us and they've already been talked through. Maybe someone's written like some kind of product brief or marketing requirements document or something. But sometimes the ideas come to us fully baked, if we're lucky. Other times they come to us half-baked. And as we all know, that can be really, really painful, right? Like just to start on a project and it's just not going well at the outset. So an Inception is a discovery workshop where you move through specific phases. And so you start very broad brushstrokes at the top in strategy. And then as you go along, depending on what your Inception will cover, you can actually get down to the very bottom with design and detail where you can actually move to delivery. And so in the space of, say, a week, maybe you have a 5-day Inception or a 2-day Inception, whatnot. An Inception is a very structured way of taking the client and the team together and moving through that project discovery process in a much more friendlier, fun, healthy way. You can see more information. A lot of what we'll be talking about today comes from the Pragmatic Programmer. If you guys haven't checked that out, I like them a lot. The Agile Samurai is a PDF. It's a really breezy read, but it's got a lot of really great information in there that you can check out, and I highly recommend it. One last thought is just that we have a whole lot of topics that we're going to be covering today that we're trying to cram into 45 minutes. So please hold your applause or your questions towards the very end. There will be Q&A at the very end when you can decide to applaud. But basically what we'll cover today is Olivia and I have put together a sample Inception agenda. And we've cherry-picked specific exercises to take you guys through, kind of give you a visual of what an Inception will look like. We're not going to, I'll just keep going. We're not going to cover every single specific exercise because we don't have the time, frankly. But we will dive down into specific exercises in each section and talk about why they're relevant to you guys as a senior engineer, or why they're relevant to you guys as a tech lead, or for you and your teams. Fantastic. So here's a picture actually of an Inception with the funnel. And if we focus on the funnel on the left, you can see you're starting in very, very broad brushstrokes at the top. You're talking about the vision. And so this is where, as a team, you're kicking off. And you're going to just build a lot of context because just because your business folks, your product owners or whatnot, they might have had a lot of discussions ahead of time and built all this context. But let's face it, they've probably had all of that without the delivery team, and you need to reestablish that context. So that's what the visioning portion is for. We'll move down into strategy. That's in the middle where you get into a lot of the details and start thinking about some of the nitty-gritty. And then by the time, you know, if you were to have a longer inception and you get to the end, that's where, that's where you'll actually start talking through things related to delivery. So that's when you might actually estimate your stories. That's when you might actually, let me move over here, get out of your way. That's when you'll actually start thinking about things like estimating your velocity as a team. And depending on your inception and what your goal is to get out of your inception, you might even have an executable product backlog to kick off with, like right after the inception ends. So that's the last thing I'll say about this. You know, depending on what, oh, if you could go back to the slide. Depending on what your goal of the inception is, you could leave with a couple of different things. You may only go as far as vision, and maybe the purpose of an inception could be a 2-day workshop where you help the client determine a vision for their product or their app. You may get a little bit further, maybe into strategy and design, and you may help them think through an actual product strategy and help them build a roadmap. Or your client may be all the way down here and they say, we want you to take us through an inception, and we need your help to help us understand for $30,000, true life example, what you can give us, what you can build us. And so that's another discussion for another day about scope. But all right, let's start with vision. For each of these, I'll give you guys a quick description of the type of exercises that you see here, and then we're going to zero in on the Infinity Map and talk specifically about that. So a kickoff is exactly what it sounds like. You get everyone in a room together who's involved on the project, and you walk through a slideshow deck, you shake hands, you meet each other, you say some things about the project, but it's just a kickoff. So it's just a kickoff. The elevator pitch is actually an exercise where you are putting together exactly what that sounds like. The elevator pitch is a 1 to 2 sentence Mad Lib style string of sentences that you put together, and you describe the product. You describe what the problem is and who it's for and why what you're building is going to be better than other alternatives out there. It's exactly what you would say to someone if they, you know, cornered you in an elevator for 30 seconds and you had to tell them what you're building. The stakeholder map is super handy. There are different approaches, you know, with sticky notes or a whiteboard, but the stakeholder map is basically an exercise where you talk about the people who are involved in your project. Who are your neighbors, the ones that you like and the ones that you don't like, who needs to be on the delivery team, do you need to involve any of the folks from security, do you need to involve anyone from customer service? And so don't think of it as just a discussion on the users, because we'll talk about that later. But the stakeholder map is specifically about just everyone on the project who might be involved and needs to know. So I'm going to skip the Infinity Map because we'll get to that in the next slide. And has anyone heard of the Iron Triangle before? All right, that's what I thought. So the Iron Triangle is kind of your classic triangle with scope, schedule, and cost. And then you have quality in the center. And the saying goes, you can pick 2, but you can never have all 3. And really, it's kind of, in my mind, when I think of the Iron Triangle, I call this exercise leading the witness, because really, if you think about it, scope, cost, and quality are never negotiable. And so really, it's a discussion where you set the context with the client to say, really where you're going to need to flex is that product backlog. You're going to need to be able to flex on scope. So it's a leading conversation. Anyway, we can talk more about that later if you guys want. Oh, okay. Yeah. Bonus points if you can identify that constellation. Okay, the Affinity Map. So the Affinity Map is your classic sticky note brainstorm. Some of you guys might have heard this. It can be called the program map. It can be called the project map, the coordinate map. I like to refer to it, if I don't call it the Affinity Map, I call it by exactly what you'll be drawing on a board, which is who, why, what, but. And the way that this looks is you basically start at a whiteboard with a blank quadrant, but it's labeled who, why, what, but. And it's a sticky note brainstorm. So on the sticky notes, you go through a round, maybe give everyone 5-10 minutes to brainstorm. But you ask them, who are we designing for in this product or this app that we're going to be building? Why are we building this app? What are the problems that we see? What are we trying to solve for? In the what box, what opportunities exist? What kind of problems are we trying to solve? So sometimes you see a lot of similarities between the what and the why. And then the but, then that's where you get to, but what constraints do we have? And so, as you go through within Affinity Map, you'll notice that some of these are grouped, because if any of you have done sticky note brainstorms before, as people put their sticky notes on the board, you group them together by affinity, you talk about them. You could also rank them by importance in each category as a very early way of kind of discovering the priorities of the client. For instance, who among all these people that we're talking about do we think is the most useful? You might just do this with a simple ranking exercise, or you could get interactive and have dot voting with dot stickers. But essentially, this is a really great exercise to kind of lead off with envisioning, because it gives you an early but a pretty broad look at the context of your project. You're talking about all these different things, and notice we haven't even gotten into design. We're not talking about any UI mockups. We haven't talked about user journeys, which we will talk about later. Personas or any of that. This is just a very, very big, broad way of kind of diving into the project, and chances are, even when you're here and talking early in the project, you'll start to hear the client start surfacing things in terms of, well, this is really important, or we have a problem with performance issues on our current app. And so the important things tend to bubble up right away, and those are good things to kind of, tuck away in the back of your mind for later.
So as an engineer, the Affinity Map may not seem like something you would use directly, but you actually can. If you are an engineer who works with other engineers, and raise your hand if you have a team of engineers that you are a member of. Okay, great. So you probably have to make decisions as a team pretty frequently. In my experience, many times those decisions end up being discussions that kind of go on and on and on, and everyone has their own ideas about the kind of features this kind of internal app you're building should have, or the way to approach building some sort of front-end framework that you're going to be implementing. So this exercise can actually take the pain and all of the time out of that discussion. This is a quick and accessible and has a very low overhead for an exercise. All you need is a wall or a whiteboard and some sticky notes and some Sharpies. It's reusable and flexible, so this you can use again and again for different projects, and from my experience it really doesn't get boring, because each problem is different. And all stakeholders can participate. It's not just two people making the decisions. You can bring in your whole engineering team to participate in this process. And it's also a great way that people of all levels of experience can feel heard in the decision that is made, because everyone is sharing an equal amount of ideas. Whether or not the ideas are used, they can lead to new directions in your application. So imagine you've been working on an app for a while. Maybe it's an internal tool that you and the team have been building, and half the team says, we want to throw it out. This sucks. We want to rebuild it from the ground up. The other half of the team says, no, we just need to make these simple improvements. It'll be great. And then one person's like, it's fine. We don't need to do anything about it. So with this, you can gather your team together, and you can reevaluate this thing, allowing each person to share their individual perspectives and share their own ideas about how it should proceed. All of those ideas are up there for everyone to see, and it's not one of those discussions that gets drawn out. You can actually group things, as Yvonne described, or you can rank them and say, well, why are we doing this? And you rank the ideas from the best ones to the worst ones, and it's kind of plain for everyone to see. So a simple exercise like this it can be quick. Literally, it can take only 20 minutes, and it can take your decision-making process, which could take days. Cut that down.
Yeah, I'll just before I talk about strategy, I'll add in these. A lot of the workshops, and especially the Affinity Map, like Olivia said, it translates so well. It's so reusable, because I had someone here who was here this morning, a previous coworker I worked with, who has since bailed, and he said, I'm not sticking around, that's just for the PM types. And I was like, no, actually it's not. All of these things that we're going to be talking about, you guys could actually use amongst the context of your own team. So that's my plug. It's not just for PMs. Strategy. Now we're moving down more towards the middle of the funnel, and strategy is where you start getting into the details. So it makes sense, usually with the strategy portion of an Inception, I like to lead off with personas, because that's where you really want to start understanding, before you talk about how and what and design, who are you building for, and who really are these people? You know, what do they like? But you talk about things like, what are their motivators? What are their demographics? You know, are they familiar with using mobile apps? And you can go all the way through a persona discussion and get a lot of valuable information that will help you in terms of creating guiding themes and guiding principles that will come up later in design and the detail section. RAID stands for risks, assumptions, issues, and dependencies. Project managers tend to love a RAID exercise because that's the stage at which you go through this exercise and it brings up really early for the team all the gotchas that you need to know about. It's like, oh yeah, the delivery team, you guys are going to be working with a team in Taiwan. That's a big constraint. And so to go through a discussion like that with RAID is really good to bring up hidden assumptions or really important constraints that might not come up otherwise until later. User journey identification, we'll talk about in a minute. Lo-fi prototyping, and there's a reason we call it lo-fi, is really fun because that can, Olivia could chime in here, but it's just really fun because in my experience that tends to be where you bring out paper prototyping, you go back to your arts and crafts phase and you start drawing and everyone gets creative. And the point of lo-fi prototyping is not to get to a final design with pixel perfect mock-ups and everything. The point of lo-fi design is to get to establish your design themes. What is important to the client in terms of the UX? What is really important to our users in terms of the UI? Story identification is kind of not glamorous. I've done a lot of it, but that's where all the story writing happens. So that's where the rubber meets the road. And then feature prioritization I'll also talk about later because it's in bold. So let's move on to user journeys. So a user journey, you guys may have heard of this. You probably have come across it as a user scenario, user flows. No one's nodding. Thank you. A user journey is a user flow or a user scenario, right? And so the way that I like to do this is definitely with sticky notes. But ideally on the wall with a huge piece of butcher paper that you can take down, roll up, and put up later. You draw your process timeline. And a user journey always has a start, or to you guys on stage, right? It would be a start and a finish. And so from a facilitator's perspective, user journey is super easy. You start at the beginning, you ask your client or you ask all the stakeholders, where in this process, what is the very first step? And then for each step, you can identify along the way who is involved in each step, what are the systems that are involved, and then pain points is your client will love to talk about that. And you just go through step by step in your user journey and you ask, okay, what happens next? What happens next? Is there a decision point? Great, we'll put a diamond on there. But as you go along, here's actually an example of a user journey. This is a pretty big one. But you can see there's some, there are always some alternate paths that can happen. And I gotta be honest, like mapping out a user journey is really mentally intensive. In an Inception, I think this is one of the most mentally exhausting activities you gotta do. But if you guys think of the information and the context and the buy-in that you're building as you go through this interactively, you're not at a whiteboard where it's uncomfortable and you're watching someone write forever as they, oh, we forgot about this step, now we got to erase it. The sticky notes do make it easier. But as you're going through the process of building this out, you're creating a huge amount of context in a really easy, portable way that you can reuse later. And for all of the devs in the room, devs really love to pay attention to, there's a color-coded example later, but devs really love to pay attention to, in each step of the process, who is my user, but also what system is involved, because system ultimately leads to data, and data ultimately leads to the data model that you guys might be building. One other bullet on the previous slide, is that you're also at this point boosting and or building your domain vocabulary, because at this point in the inception, this is probably the first time where all of you have met together and you've really started talking about the details, and that's when you really start learning the vocabulary of your domain, and you hear your client talk about things like I won't give an example because that'll take too long. But my point is that as you start talking through these user journeys, that's where you start hearing and getting familiar with and defining a lot of the domain vocabulary that you guys will be using as a team. That, like, 10 sprints later, you'll just be throwing out the vocabulary that everyone knows.
So how are these user journeys applicable to engineering teams? We're not really, as engineers, user experience people. However, we are users ourselves. We build things that fall into processes, and then we have to use those processes again and again and again. Well, where do those processes come from? You can actually use this similar technique to design your own process as an engineer. And again, like the previous exercise, you can bring in all of your engineers into the same room and say, okay, we're going to design the deployment process together. And to Yvonne's point about domain knowledge, your front-end engineers will kind of understand and have the vocabulary that your ops team will be using at the end of that process. So as kind of like a basic idea of how one of these interactive diagrams comes together, you have a little sticky that represents a step in the journey, and you can use a smaller sticky note. Sticky notes come in all sorts of sizes these days, to identify the user who's going to be performing that step. And then you might have decision points where your diagram kind of breaks up and changes direction. So imagine you're working on a new release process. Your diagram might start to look something like this. So you update your working tree, and then you merge into master, and then there's like this little there's pain point there. That is a merge conflict. What kind of process do you have to resolve merge conflicts? Maybe it's like that's when you bring pairing in there. Mm-hmm. And then, is the JS updated or not? Okay, well then you have to run this command. Any dev can do that. Then you test locally, and there would be more there, and ... and then you test on staging, and Lauren does that, and then ... And then the ops team would be releasing it to production, and then, whatever deploy base pull. But with a diagram like this, you can see how the sticky notes could grow and grow and grow, and you can move them on the wall, and you can outline your whole process, take a photo on your iPhone of the process, and then send that to the whole team and document it in whatever wiki or project management tool that you use.
Or leave it on the wall.
Or leave it on the wall, yeah.
All right, so that was user journeys. Let's talk about feature prioritization, which I think is really fun. This first bullet up here, be honest. How many of you guys have ever worked on a feature where you looked at it and you're like, if this were my app, no. Anyone? That's what I thought. So feature prioritization is where you can basically bring your experience and your expertise, right? We've locked you all in a room and said, you're in an inception. Now's your big chance to actually influence and shout down PO. No, I'm kidding. But your chance to influence the PO and say, maybe you don't want to build a feature quite that way. So I have some sample cards. Remember previously in strategy we said you would go through story estimation. So the output of that activity is you will have, in the best of all worlds, story cards where you have your user story headline as I want, so that. And you have a ton of these cards. Pro tip, if you go through story estimation, write your story numbers on the back. We'll talk about why in a bit. But anyway, you have all of these story cards, and you have a really, really large conference room table. And this is an exercise for the product owner. And you could just throw your cards out on the table in any which way. And then the conversation with the product owner goes, tell us what is the most important feature for this app or this product that we're building. What is the most important feature that should be at the very top of the backlog that we should work on? And the PO is probably going to do one thing first, which is they're going to reach for the first chronological feature, which is probably going to be something like login. And all of us know, no. login is not the most important, that can come later. What is really the most important feature? And they'll say, oh, okay. So they'll think for a while and they'll say, I need to display a catalog of my items. And they'll move a card to the top of the table. And then as you keep going through this exercise, things will start dropping out. And for some cards, the PO may look at a card and they're like, oh, no, that was just something that we talked about. And they'll put it off to the side. And what happens is that as you go through the feature prioritization exercise, an MVP, a minimum viable product timeline, really does emerge. It might be on the left side of the table, it might be at the top of the table, but you actually will see an actual dividing line occur where the PO has said, this is the most important stuff, and the other stuff is less important. And so what eventually happens, this is obviously a nice clean version, but as you're building this, and you can document this later, you're actually building out, you're actually helping your product owner build out an early version of your product roadmap. How great is that, right? Like, how many of us have ever actually got to do that and really sit with the product owner and influence them? So that's one of the reasons why I love this exercise in particular with Inception. So it might be for the first release, you have a PO who actually says, yeah, here are all the things that we actually do need to get to a minimum viable product. These are our must-haves that, I'll pay you guys however much money you want. And then there are others where the PO might say, these are our should-haves. These would be really nice if you guys are totally awesome and rock out with your sprints and have awesome velocity. These are the nice-to-haves that it might be nice to fit into release 1. And then everything else falls to the bottom. But that's what I'm referring to when I say MVP timeline, because, I don't know, at least as a facilitator, most of the time when I've watched engineers and POs go through this exercise, to me it's actually really interesting and exciting to see that timeline appear on the table.
So a big part of this feature prioritization exercise is owning the scope. So in this exercise, if you are an engineer performing this, it's a way that you can take the features that have been given to you or that you've inherited that you need to build and prioritize them, whether it's for yourself or you're doing it as a team. But it's a great way to find out and reach consensus on what is most valuable for the project or the current release or the next release or the next year. So imagine, and this comes from personal experience, imagine you kind of inherit a project and there's this huge backlog of things that you need to build for it. And it keeps accumulating, and there are people who say, well, what about this idea? Do you really need to do that? And what about this idea? You can bring those people who are stakeholders in your project together in the room, write your backlog on these cards. They don't have to be user stories. They can be features in your application, and work with the group that you have to create a diagram like this and have the ones that are most important to you and to the group rise above that timeline, and then let the others fall into different releases.
All right. So design in detail. Now we're getting to the bottom of the funnel. Cross-functional requirements identification is just a fancy way of saying what are all of the gotchas. I like this exercise because it's one where I can kind of stand back. But usually, actually, my senior engineers or a tech lead of mine will lead this exercise. And what this is, I'm happy to share a resource if you'd like afterwards. But I have a PDF with a bunch of index cards. You print the PDF out and you have a bunch of index cards. And on each card, kind of quiz style, is a word that you want to put in front of your PO. You just kind of throw it on the table and you have them think about it. And this is a discussion that surfaces hidden requirements, hidden constraints. These are all of the gotchas. And so an example might be, I have a card about responsiveness. How responsive do they want the app to be? How scalable does it need to be? What about security? Security is an example of a word on one of these quiz cards. Or user experience. Does our app need to be ADA compliant? And so it's kind of from the team's perspective, it's kind of an easy exercise, but it actually is really valuable because it generates a lot of good things for you to know that, again, become either design principles or guiding themes for the team as you guys dive down into delivery and execution later. It's like, oh yeah, remember, we're going to need to build this, and so, therefore, we're going to adjust accordingly. Story estimation. How many of you have ever been locked in a room with someone like me and they told you to estimate all your story cards? Yeah. So during an Inception, that's exactly what I would do, you lucky people. We would have story cards like this. And I mentioned earlier, put your story estimates on the back of your cards. I've written them in permanent marker today because of the next exercise I'm going to tell you guys about. But story estimation is exactly what it sounds like. You have your team, you give them a bunch of cards, you guys have gone through all these other discussions and conversations, and so you have all this other context. And as a team, you should now be able to put together like, oh, we think this is a 3-pointer, we think this is a 5-pointer, and it can't be broken down. So that's what you do in estimation. You use that information in the velocity game, which we'll talk about next. Tech review is an exercise where I like to take the architects, the tech leads, the team leads, the senior engineers, basically any engineer will do. And I basically point them towards a whiteboard and I say, guys, I need one slide that basically will show the system or the architecture or the framework that we're going to use. And I want you guys to talk about it and decide and agree. Don't come to blows, but all I need is one slide. And that's what basically that discussion's about. It's just a whiteboarding session. But ultimately, it's a slide that comes together that you put together in the show solution, which in my world usually tends to be either a PDF or a deck that you put together and you recap everything and put it and deliver it to your product owner. And again, depending on what we mentioned earlier, as far as how far you go down the funnel in Inception, maybe their show solution is only going to be about a product vision, or maybe you got all the way down here and you not only estimated the backlog and got a velocity out, but now you can actually calculate, one of 3 target release dates for release 1, depending on how many developer pairs they're willing to pay for. So that's your show solution. Let's talk about the velocity game. The velocity game is really great if you guys have ever been in a situation where you're on a brand new project and you're also there with a brand new team. Or if you're on a new project that's kicked off, but you are new to the team and the other people there have been doing their thing for a while, right? But the point is you need a forecast, but you guys may not have written any code together yet, and so you're trying to figure out, how do we do this? So the velocity game is great because you take the output from your previous Inception exercise, and someone like me, the facilitator, would shuffle and randomize all of these. And when you play the velocity game, it's important to estimate the way that you guys would actually code. So we talked about pair programming in the previous panel. If you guys pair, you should estimate as a pair. If you don't pair, you should estimate individually. But let's pretend we have a pair. So in the velocity game, the very first thing that I would do is I would go in front of one pair and I would say, here's the first random story. We have one sprint. Do you think that you could actually accomplish this story in the sprint, right? And they don't know the points because you wrote it in pen on the back, unlike my example here. And their answer should be yes because it's the very first card. So they can get one story done in a sprint. Otherwise, you have bigger problems. And they're going to say yes. And then you flip the next card off the stack and you say, okay, great, how about this one? And they're like, yeah, okay. And the next, and you just keep flipping off the stack. And eventually at some point they're going to say, no, like those were pretty complex, that's enough. And you say, great, now I have a set. And then you just rinse and repeat. And you say, how about this one? How about this one? How about this one? And then you say, nope, and it's great, set 2. And so, as you guys can see, we're going along, and for this one developer pair, we are building sets, and unbeknownst to them, oh, look at my example. We have story card estimates on the back. These all happen totally random. These happen to add up to 4 points and 4 points. And so what you're doing with each pair is as you're going along, for each pair, you're building these sets with their best estimates. It's totally randomized, so you do want to throw out the low end and the high end, the outliers. But eventually, as you go along, you should get to a point where eventually as you're going along the table, you see these sets on the table and you're like, okay, I think this is good enough. And then you turn to the next pair and you rinse and repeat. And then at the end of that, you calculate and you have an average velocity, right? And so the last thing I want to say about the velocity game is always have your developers estimate realistically. Don't have them pad, any of these or don't have them, try and buffer any of the stories. Have them estimate realistically, and then with your PM or your coach on your team, you can always decide if we have a project where we're going through over Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. Focus factor is going to be a little bit down. Let's buffer it with like an 80% focus factor. But have your developers estimate realistically.
So is there anyone here who is not an Agile programmer, at least right now, or doesn't practice Agile programming with velocity and things like that? Okay. Cool. All right, mostly Agile, but I believe that you can translate this exercise to non-Agile teams as well. The velocity game is a way to quantify your capacity to basically produce. So whenever you're basing estimations on an educated guess rather than actual numbers or data or prior events and prior workload, that's kind of a red flag, and you should take a step back. This game can be used in those instances. For instance, if you're working on 2 important projects and a third one is looming, you might want to consider gathering your engineering team together to make sure everyone is actually being honest about their velocity. And this game can be great at figuring that out. So that was the last kind of dive into these exercises that we were going to do today. But we have some time for questions. So if you have any questions about the things that we talked about or the things that we just kind of briefly talked about, yes.
You mentioned only using realistic estimates for building that. I found a lot of help recently with my developers doing low, medium, high estimates. And whenever there's a huge delta between medium and like the high worst case, that helps me kind of cherry pick stories, kind of promote those. Did you, for any kind of project that might have a higher degree of risk, do you recommend doing that as well?
I think so, because the unspoken part of actually generating, when you go through the story estimation exercise, right, is that as you guys are coming together with these numbers, that's something that you guys, as the group of engineers actually estimating the story, that's conversations that I've heard. It's horse trading or whatever you want to call it, but they're going to say, you know what, this is a brand new domain and it's really technical and we don't know anything about it. Let's be safe in our estimates. And that's a perfectly fine answer because it might be brand new code for a brand new domain. So, yep, totally reasonable.
So if I understand you correctly, the story estimation meets velocity game is sort of this thing where you try to estimate the size of something and then you try to figure out how many of those things would fit into a similar sized box. The box being a week.
Oh, okay, yes.
And then you sort of take the average. So the point of that is averaging a bit because both are, I mean, ultimately guesses to some extent. So
right. So let me.
Like an average game.
It is, and right. The way that you come up with that velocity that you're ultimately going to use is a game of averages. You throw out the highs, you throw out the lows, and then you find something in the middle.
Yvonne mentioned in the beginning, talking about this exercise, that it's great if you have a team that's new to each other, and you're not really sure how they're going to play off each other or how well they're going to work together. Maybe there's a new hire. This game can kind of like help figure that out.
Yeah, and like a real world example is I remember in one Inception, we actually went through the velocity game, and it was for an app that was replacing a paper system. So there was no code, and the team was brand new. And the client had about, I think it was 550K as their budget. And those were kind of the parameters. And they said, okay, and we went through an Inception and talked about all the things they wanted to build. We had them define an MVP in feature prioritization. And then we finally, the client turned to us and they asked, well, when can you deliver this? Well, the only credible way that you can actually make some kind of estimate for a release date is if you say, okay, well, assuming we have 5 developers and we're going to be running 2-week sprints, we have to know what we think our velocity is going to be in order that we can actually predict and say, we think you could get this in October. But if you hire on an additional pair, we could pull that release date in and get you, say, maybe I'm just making up examples, but like a mid-September type of release. So I saw some other hands in the front row.
All right, so a couple of things. One, So is it the same team that's making the estimates and putting them on the back of the card for the numbers?
Yes.
And you just count on they haven't seen them in a while, so they'll basically
Yeah.
look at it fresh.
Yeah, the same team throughout your inception, right? Your client stakeholders may change, but everyone who's in the room going through these exercises is the team that's actually going to be writing code and actually doing the delivery. And you're absolutely right. It's kind of like a little bit of make-believe, but whenever I get to the velocity game, I tell the engineers, I was like, just forget about the numbers, pretend you don't know them, and they play along. And if you write them, in something that's doesn't bleed through the front, that helps too.
I can see that. The other thing is, the other aspect I've seen use of velocity and points is planning game and trade-off with stakeholders. So here we're talking. So you're saying you already got that prioritization from the stakeholder, and you're just basically that's how you're putting off that list of cards and handing them to the pair and saying, can you get? So you're the one handling that as the project manager.
Yes.
Okay. Get that.
Some of this is though we've tried to kind of break these exercises out as little reusable pieces that you can kind of tailor and co-opt for your own purposes outside of a formal inception.
Right.
So if you're working internally on something with your team, maybe there's not a product owner. It's more about the development team owning your own work, I think, is kind of like the other side of this presentation. So we're hoping that you'll be more involved in this the inception process, but also kind of taking little bits and pieces of it,
Right.
turning it into ways that the engineering team can make decisions as well without new business potentially.
Not every inception agenda will look like this. This is about a 4 or a 5 day inception. So that's actually a ton of content. And there are also different exercises that we didn't include here because we kind of cherry picked a couple together and put them together and said this would make sense for kind of a sample agenda, assuming you're building a web app, for instance. But yeah, your inceptions could be a lot shorter, or they could be a little bit longer if there have been 2-week inceptions. They're really involved. But you could have like an inception for 2 weeks if you wanted to. But like Olivia said, the point is we're not recommending because we glossed over a lot of these exercises. The point is from what you're hearing today, we're hoping, like you guys saw on one of the slides that went whizzing by, you're building up your toolkit, right? Because there are a lot of techniques and a lot of things that I personally have found have been really useful from running an inception, even when I haven't actually been in an inception, and I've reused it with project teams. So, yes.
You answered my previous question, which is like, how much was this? But I have another question, which is, do you have this written up as blog posts or anything? I would love to remember details about some of these activities that are so useful. Did I miss it? You already saw it.
Yeah.
Okay.
That is very inspiring, and maybe we should write blog posts about them.
Yeah, we both have blogs.
I need to make a blog, actually, but I will. Thank you.
PromptWorks has a blog.
PromptWorks has a blog. But this book contains a lot of detailed information about how you can run these exercises yourself. There's also a book called Game Storming, which is similar and takes a more sort of ad hoc approach. So I would recommend both, but yeah, we will write a blog post. Okay.
Yeah, the Agile Samurai too. Just so we're full transparency. There's I want to say I think it's one section among many that covers the inception. So it's not, this book is not all about agile inceptions, but it actually is just about how to be an awesome agile team and how to be an agile samurai on your team. So even if you're not interested in inceptions, I don't know why you wouldn't be, but if you're not, I would still encourage you to read Agile Samurai because it's a really great read, and Game Storming as well. So in the back. Do you want to talk about DuckDuckGo?
Yes. So DuckDuckGo, my company, is not an agile company. We kind of cherry pick a few principles, but our teams are very cross-functional. our domain knowledge is very diverse, and so we have areas of responsibility that are separate from our skills in some cases, and it's sort of an autonomous, trust-based system with protocols that support it. So I'm not sure in the case of an agile team, I don't think it's as typically as cross-functional.
Yeah, with agile teams, I've worked with both, and I would say my personal experience working with a team of full stack developers has been the rare exception versus the norm. For whatever reason, most of the teams that I've worked on have very clearly separate dev roles. So I'm just curious why you ask.
I practice the same, but I've been talking agile coaches. They want everybody.
Full stack?
Yes.
Full stack is the best of all worlds. If you can get it with like polyglot developers, that's great. Yeah, and that may be another discussion for happy hour, but I think that the Agile community definitely sees that as somewhere aspirational to go. Everyone agrees it's the best of all worlds, but me personally, in practice, I don't think we're there yet. I haven't seen that yet, and there are a whole lot of reasons why. So.
That's our next presentation.
And blog post. With that.
So during the exercise that you were talking about, use post-it notes or paper or whatever. How do you do those with remote employees, or is there just not a way maybe to get everybody in the same?
Great question. For inceptions, I like to, and this is usually in the negotiation phase with the client, where you tell them, we want 4 days of your time, uninterrupted, no meetings, no emails. After they get over that shock, that's where you want to tell them, and we really, 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 really emphasize that everyone be in the same room together. Because if you think about that funnel, and you think about all the discussions that you're having and the context that you're building, that's really hard to do if someone is remote. Because let's face it, no matter how hard as a remote participant you may tune in and try and follow, there's probably bad sound quality, people are going to forget about you, et cetera, and it's just better if you're there in the room. And so that's why I draw a hard line as a past facilitator of Inceptions. I'm like, everybody's got to be in the room. There's, we can negotiate with like if you need email breaks or something. I will say if you're trying to do like an Affinity Map remote, they're just that one exercise. There are lots of different tools online where you have a virtual canvas and you have sticky notes and you can put on there. It's more work for whoever's facilitating. I know that in the past when I've done that, it's a lot harder to keep people corralled and focused. But you can do it. But I definitely wouldn't recommend that for like multiple participants in an Inception.
Yeah, and I would add to that in the case of having your clients in the room, you definitely want them all there.
Oh, yeah.
I have run these exercises partially remote, where half the team is remote and half of them are all together in the room. And as Yvonne said, it can be very taxing on the facilitator because you need to ensure that everyone there feels as though they are part of the exercise, which involves like multiple cameras so that they can see and be seen and feel as though they're part of the group, even though they're just like a face on a laptop. Other issues are translating the work that they're doing into physical artifacts in the space. So you can use things like projection systems to do that, where they're sharing a screen so that everyone can see. So it's very involved, but it can be done, and hopefully more tools will be made to help with that.
I think we're being ushered off the stage.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.